The metal door swung open with a sound like a dying animal. Steam poured into the hallway, thick and white and alive, swallowing the fluorescent lights one by one. Margaret Fisher's legs turned to water. Behind her, 37 German women pressed against the opposite wall, their backs flat against cold concrete, their eyes fixed on the white void beyond that doorway. Someone whispered in German, voice breaking, "Please, no, not this. Please, God, not the gas." They knew what happened in American showers. The propaganda had been very specific, very detailed, frighteningly clear. This was where prisoners went to die. Sergeant Dorothy Matthews stood in the doorway with a clipboard in one hand and an expression Margaret couldn't read. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, just professional detachment, the face of someone who had done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times again. Inside, Matthews said in accented German, "All of you, remove your clothing completely. You'll be deloused and cleaned before assignment to barracks." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. Remove clothing. Gas chambers disguised as showers. That's what they'd been told since 1943 in a lecture hall in Stuttgart, where an SS officer had shown them photographs and spoken with absolute certainty about American methods of execution. But what came through those showerheads in the next 20 minutes wasn't gas. It was something far more dangerous to everything they believed. It was truth. And the choice Margaret would make in that doorway would echo through the rest of her life and through history itself. If you're watching right now, before we see what happened when Margaret Fisher stepped into that shower room, before we understand why 38 German women were standing in Louisiana believing they were about to die, you need to know 3 things. First, why these women were in America at all. Second, exactly what they'd been taught in a Stuttgart lecture hall 2 years earlier and why that training was so convincing. And third, what Sergeant Dorothy Matthews was thinking as she watched these women refuse to move and why her face went pale when she finally understood their terror. But there's something else you should know. Something that wouldn't become clear until weeks later when Margaret would sit in a camp library reading the American Constitution and realize that the shower wasn't the only lie she'd been told. If you're watching right now, I need your help proving something. My daughter says these old stories don't matter anymore, that nobody cares what happened in a Louisiana prisoner of war camp in 1945. She says the greatest generation's choices are ancient history irrelevant to the world we live in now. But I believe these moments shaped the America we know today. I believe the decision to treat enemies with decency, even when they expected death, is what made us different, is what still makes us different. If you agree, if you think stories like Margaret's deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. Help me prove that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about human beings making impossible choices in impossible situations and living with the consequences of those choices for the rest of their lives. Now let's go back 2 weeks. To March 12th, 1945. To a communications bunker outside Mannheim, Germany, where Margaret Fisher's world was about to end. She had no idea that the American soldiers surrounding her building would change everything she believed about enemies, about war, and about who the real barbarians were. March 12, 1945, 5:30 in the morning, Wehrmacht Communications Center, Mannheim. The smell hit you first when you entered the bunker. Burnt ersatz. Coffee that wasn't really coffee at all, just roasted barley and chicory root. Cigarette smoke hanging in layers near the ceiling. Machine oil from the typewriters. And underneath it all, the sharp metallic scent of fear that had been seeping into the concrete walls for months as the war turned against Germany. The sound was constant, a rhythmic industrial symphony. The clatter of typewriters as women transcribed, intercepted Allied communications. The static hiss of radio transmissions crackling through speakers mounted on every wall. The tick-tick-tick of the telegraph machines that never stopped, never slowed, just kept receiving bad news from every front. Margaret Fisher adjusted her headphones and focused on the coded Allied transmission scrolling across her notepad. 24 years old, one of the youngest senior cipher clerks in the Mannheim facility. She was good at her work. She took pride in it. In a world falling apart around her, her ability to break enemy codes was something solid, something that mattered, something that made her valuable. On her desk, in a small silver frame that was probably worth more than she'd earn in a month, sat a photograph. Her mother Helga, 52 years old, with deep lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before the war. Her sister Helena, just 16, with blonde braids and a shy smile that the camera had caught in a rare, unguarded moment. Both of them were still in Cologne, or what remained of Cologne after the RAF raids had turned most of the city into a landscape of broken brick and twisted metal. Eva Brenner appeared at Margaret's shoulder with 2 tin cups of the terrible ersatz coffee. "Another message from Eisenhower's headquarters," Eva said. "They're not even encrypting properly anymore. It's like they don't care if we intercept them." "Why would they?" Margaret kept writing, her pencil moving quickly across the paper. "They know we can't stop them. They know it's over. Don't let Frau Richter hear you say that." Margaret glanced toward the supervisor's desk, where Hildegard Richter sat ramrod straight, reviewing transmission logs with the focused intensity of someone who couldn't afford to think about anything else. Frau Richter had lost both her sons on the Eastern Front. The first at Stalingrad in '43, frozen to death in a trench outside the city. The second outside Warsaw in '44, killed by Soviet artillery during the retreat. The regime, the ideology, the belief that Germany was still fighting for something noble and necessary, that was all she had left. Take that away, and she'd collapse like a building with its foundation removed. The facility radio played softly in the background, tuned to the German propaganda station that broadcast around the clock. Goebbels' voice crackled through the static, sharp and insistent reading from a prepared script about American barbarism in the occupied territories. "The Americans show no mercy to prisoners," the voice said. "They use methods too horrifying to describe in detail on the radio. Remember what they did to their own native populations during their expansion westward. Remember that these are not civilized people despite their claims. They are savages who have learned to wear suits and ties." Margaret had dismissed most of it as exaggeration. Morale propaganda designed to keep Germans fighting when the logical thing to do was surrender. But some of it had to be true, didn't it? You couldn't just make up everything. There had to be some kernel of reality underneath the exaggeration. The Americans wouldn't bomb cities full of women and children if they were truly civilized. The British wouldn't firebomb Dresden if they cared about human life. The first shell hit the building's east wing at 5:47. The explosion was so loud it felt physical, like being punched in the chest by an invisible fist. The lights flickered and went out for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. When they came back on, dust was falling from the ceiling in thick sheets, coating every surface with a fine white powder that got in your mouth and nose and made breathing difficult. Someone screamed. A woman at the far end of the room, young, maybe 19, fresh from training, and not ready for this. The floor bucked beneath Margaret's chair. The framed photograph fell face down on her desk. She grabbed it instinctively, clutched it to her chest, as if protecting this small piece of paper and glass could somehow protect the people in it. "Raus, raus!" Frau Richter was standing now, shouting over the sound of more shells landing closer. "Emergency protocol. Destroy the code books. Everything classified goes into the furnace now." But there was no time. By 6:15 the shelling had stopped and American voices were shouting outside the building in accented German that was somehow more terrifying than if they'd shouted in English. "Hände hoch, hands up. Come out now. All personnel exit the building immediately with hands visible." Margaret emerged into cold morning air with her hands raised above her head, the framed photograph left behind on her desk because Frau Richter had made them leave everything. 43 other women came out behind her, filing through the door in a line, blinking in the pale dawn light. The American soldiers were young. Some of them looked barely 20, with smooth faces and uncertain expressions, like they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. One of them, a private with red hair and freckles across his nose, just stared and muttered something under his breath. "Jesus," one of them said in English. "They're all women. They didn't tell us they'd be women." Shame burned through Margaret's chest. Not just the shame of defeat, of being captured, of having failed in her duty. Something deeper than that. Something more personal. She was enemy property now. Her body, her future, everything that made her who she was, all of it belonged to whoever had won this war. And America had won. Within hours, Margaret would be loaded onto a truck heading west through the ruins of Germany. Within days, she'd cross an ocean she'd never seen before. And within 2 weeks, she'd face a choice between everything she'd been taught to believe and what her own eyes were telling her was true. To understand Margaret's terror at that shower room door, we need to go back further, to April 1943, to a lecture hall in Stuttgart where 200 young women in Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms learned exactly what awaited captured auxiliaries in American hands. The lecture hall smelled like floor wax and nervous sweat and the cheap wool of 200 identical uniforms. Uncomfortable wooden chairs scraped against the floor as the women found their seats. At the front of the room, a male SS officer stood at a podium, his uniform crisp and perfect, an iron cross pinned to his chest, catching the light from the overhead fixtures. A projector hummed in the back corner, throwing a beam of light onto a white screen behind the officer. "What I'm about to tell you may save your life," the officer said. His voice carried across the silent room with the confidence of someone used to being believed. "If you are captured by American or British forces, you will face a carefully designed system of deception." 200 pairs of eyes locked forward. Margaret was 22 then, newly assigned to communications work, still believing that Germany was defending itself against aggressors, still trusting that the information she was given came from reliable sources. "They will tell you they follow the Geneva Convention," the officer continued. "They will seem professional, organized, even kind. They will offer you medical care, food. They will document everything with paperwork and photographs. All of this is designed to make you trust them." Click. The slide changed. A photograph appeared on the screen, grainy and black and white, showing what looked like a processing facility. Rows of benches, white tiled walls, shower heads mounted on those walls. "They will tell you that you need to be processed," the officer said, "that you need to be deloused, that you must shower for hygiene purposes before being assigned to barracks. This is critical information. Listen carefully. The showers are not for cleaning. They are execution chambers." The gasp that went through the room was audible, collective, a shared intake of breath that seemed to lower the air pressure. "The Americans learned this method from their own history," the officer continued. "The systematic extermination of inferior races during their westward expansion. They have practiced these techniques for over a century. Now they apply them to prisoners of war. It is efficient. It is clean. It leaves no visible wounds on the bodies." Click. Another photograph. Another shower room. White tiles. A central drain. Nothing that looked obviously sinister, which somehow made it worse. "You will be ordered to remove your clothing," the officer said. "You will be told to enter the shower room in groups. The doors will seal behind you. What comes through those shower heads is not water, it is gas, carbon monoxide or Zyklon B depending on the facility. Within minutes, everyone inside is dead. The bodies are removed, burned or buried, and the room is prepared for the next group." Margaret's hands had gone cold. She was 22 years old, still young enough to believe that authority figures told the truth, that photographs didn't lie, that an SS officer with an Iron Cross wouldn't stand in front of 200 women and describe something this specific if it wasn't real. "If you are captured," the officer said, "and I pray none of you ever are, you must resist the shower order at all costs. Better to die fighting with dignity than to die naked in an American gas chamber. Better to be shot trying to escape than to walk voluntarily into an execution facility disguised as a hygiene measure." The lights came back on. The projection screen went blank. 200 women sat in silence processing what they'd just heard. Margaret remembered that silence now 2 years later, sitting in the back of an American transport truck with Eva beside her and Frau Richter in the front. "Do you remember Stuttgart?" Eva whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the truck's engine. "The lecture about the showers." Margaret's stomach clenched. "Don't think about it. But what if he was right?" Eva's fingers gripped the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles had gone white. "What if everything he said was true? Then there's nothing we can do about it," Margaret said. "So there's no point thinking about it." From the front of the truck, Frau Richter's voice cut through. "Whatever they do to us, we face it with dignity. We are German women. We don't break. We don't beg. We face our fate with the courage our sons showed on the battlefield." But Margaret could see Frau Richter's hands shaking where they gripped her knees. The truck rolled west through a Germany that Margaret barely recognized. They traveled for 3 days, and every kilometer revealed more devastation. Cologne, her hometown, was rubble. She pressed her face against the wire mesh covering the truck's window, straining to find her street, the neighborhood where she'd grown up, the corner where she'd bought bread every morning before work. None of it existed anymore. The cathedral still stood, its twin spires reaching toward grey sky, but everything around it was flattened, reduced to broken brick and twisted metal, and the hollow shells of buildings with their facades intact, but nothing behind them. "That was my school," Margaret whispered, pointing to a pile of stones that might have once been a building. "That corner, that's where I bought bread. And there, that's where—" She stopped. What used to be there didn't matter anymore. It was gone. All of it was gone. Eva gripped her hand. Neither of them spoke after that. "This is temporary," Frau Richter said, her voice brittle and too loud. "A setback. The Führer has secret weapons. The Wunderwaffen will turn the tide. You'll see." "The Führer is dead or hiding in a bunker," Margaret heard herself say. "And there are no wonder weapons. There's just this." She gestured at the ruins streaming past the window. "This is what winning looks like, apparently." Frankfurt was burning when they passed through on the second day. Smoke columns rose from the city center, thick and black, blotting out the afternoon sun. American bombers were visible in the daylight sky, tiny silver specks so high up they looked like stars. Refugees clogged the roads, old people pulling carts loaded with everything they owned, children with hollow eyes and dirt-smeared faces, walking in long lines toward destinations that probably didn't exist anymore. Annie Vogel, the youngest of them at 19, started crying quietly. They said we were winning. They said the Americans were on the verge of collapse. They said victory was certain. They lied, Eva said quietly, about everything. On the third day, they reached the port at Le Havre. The American ship dominated the harbor, massive and grey and bristling with anti-aircraft guns. American flags snapped in the cold wind, the stars and stripes visible from half a kilometer away. Sailors moved across the deck with purpose and efficiency and confidence, the body language of people who knew they'd won. "Gott im Himmel," someone whispered. "How did we ever think we could beat them?" "They're taking us to America to die there," Frau Richter said. "International observers can't see what they do on their own soil. They can claim we died of disease or accidents, and no one can prove otherwise." But Margaret noticed something. The ship was in perfect condition. no battle damage, no signs of wear. The crew looked healthy, well-fed, their uniforms clean and properly fitted. Everything about the ship, the sailors, the operation of loading prisoners aboard, all of it spoke of abundant resources and careful organization. The gangplank clanged under Margaret's boots as she climbed toward the deck. Metal on metal, a sound that felt final somehow. She looked back once at Europe, at the smoke on the horizon, at the destroyed continent she was leaving behind. She didn't know it yet, but she'd never see Germany the same way again. Within 12 days, everything she believed about the world would shatter like glass dropped on stone. And it would start with something as simple and profound as hot water. They were taken down into the hold through narrow metal stairs that rang with each footstep. Margaret expected cells, cages, the kind of cramped, deliberately cruel confinement she'd heard described in the propaganda broadcasts. What waited below was none of those things. It was just a hold. A converted cargo space with 38 metal bunks bolted to the walls in 2 tiers. Thin mattresses, but real mattresses, not bare metal or wooden boards. Wool blankets folded at the foot of each bunk. A coal stove in the center of the room already lit, radiating warmth into the cold space. Windows near the ceiling, small portholes that let in grey afternoon light. Better than the last place Margaret had slept in Germany. Better than the basement shelter in Mannheim, where she'd spent the final weeks before capture huddled with other communications staff while bombs fell close enough to make the ground shake. An American sailor appeared in the doorway. Red hair freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks, couldn't have been older than 20. He carried an armful of additional blankets, navy blue with yellow stripes at the edges. "Gonna be cold tonight," he said in broken German, his accent so thick Margaret had to concentrate to understand him. "Extra blanket if you need. Just ask guard." He smiled, not a cruel smile, not mocking. Just a kid doing his job, trying to be helpful, like he was showing new guests to their rooms at a hotel instead of processing enemy prisoners. Eva stared at the blanket in her hands after he'd gone. Why would they give us extra blankets? No one answered, because no one had an answer that made sense. The ship's horn blasted a sound so deep and loud, Margaret felt it vibrate in her chest. The engines thrummed to life beneath their feet, a steady, powerful rhythm that shook the bunks and made the coal stove rattle slightly. The whole massive vessel shuddered once, then began to move. Margaret sat on her assigned bunk and ran her hand over the thin mattress. Through the porthole above her head, she could see smoke on the horizon. Germany was disappearing behind them, swallowed by distance and ocean haze. Everything she knew was back there, receding with every revolution of the ship's propellers. Everything she feared was ahead. If they're going to kill us, why give us blankets? The question wouldn't leave her mind. It made no sense. You didn't waste resources on people you planned to execute. You didn't show small kindnesses to prisoners you believed were subhuman, unless the kindness itself was part of the cruelty, a way to make the final betrayal more devastating. That question would haunt Margaret for 12 days crossing the Atlantic, and the answer when it finally came would be more disturbing than any propaganda. They were giving blankets because they actually followed their own rules, because to them, even enemies were human beings entitled to basic dignity. The concept was so foreign to everything Margaret had experienced in the last 2 years of total war that her mind struggled to accept it as real. The first meal came 2 hours after they'd left port. Tin bowls were distributed by 2 sailors who moved through the hold with practiced efficiency. Margaret looked down at hers and felt her breath catch in her throat. Hot soup. She could see steam rising from the surface. Actual chunks of potato carrot beans floating in clear broth. When had she last smelled real vegetable soup made with actual vegetables instead of withered turnips and potato peels? And bread. Real bread. not the sawdust and wood pulp mixture that had passed for bread in Germany's final months. This was pale and soft, made with actual wheat flour. You could see the texture of it, the way it gave slightly when you pressed a finger against it. They ate in silence. Every woman afraid to acknowledge what this meant, afraid to speak the thought that was forming in all their minds simultaneously. Eva finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are they feeding us? If they're going to kill us anyway, why waste food?" Frau Richter had an answer ready, delivered with the certainty of someone who couldn't afford doubt. Making us strong enough for labor, or fattening us like livestock before slaughter. It's more efficient to work us hard for a few months, extract whatever value they can, then dispose of us when we're used up. But Margaret was noticing things that Frau Richter was ignoring. The Navy corpsman who came when Annie Vogel got seasick on the second day treated her gently, gave her medicine that actually worked, told her to drink water and rest, and that she'd adjust to the ship's motion. The guards who were firm when they needed to be, but never cruel, never violent, never deliberately humiliating. The food that came twice daily, regular as clockwork, adequate portions, sometimes even warm. No beatings, no deliberate cruelty, no sadistic guards who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. Just routine, just procedure, just men doing their jobs with professional detachment. On the seventh night at sea, unable to sleep because of the constant engine vibration and the questions running through her mind, Margaret lay in her bunk and listened to the whispered conversations happening in the darkness around her. "I heard they work prisoners to death," one voice said. 20-hour days in factories or mines until you collapse. Then they just replace you with the next batch. "I heard they don't feed anyone at all once you reach the camps," another voice added. "Just slow starvation, easier than bullets, and you can claim it was disease." "I heard the camps in America are worse than anything in Europe because they don't have to worry about international observers seeing what happens," a third voice whispered. "They can do whatever they want on their own soil." Frau Richter's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and certain. "The Americans are hypocrites. They bomb our cities, kill our children, burn people alive with incendiary bombs, then act shocked when we call them barbarians. At least the Russians are honest about their brutality. The Americans hide theirs behind smiles and paperwork, and Geneva Convention rules they have no intention of following. But they're feeding us now," Eva said quietly from the bunk beside Margaret's. "That corpsman helped Annie. Helped. The guards haven't hurt anyone. What if some of what we were told was true and some of it wasn't? How do we know which parts to believe?" "You believe what serves the enemy's purposes," Frau Richter said. "Everything they're doing now is designed to make us compliant, to make us weak, to make us forget our duty and our loyalty. Don't fall for it." Margaret said nothing, just stared at the metal ceiling of the hold, watching shadows move across it as the ship rolled gently through Atlantic swells. Her mind was a battlefield where everything she'd been taught fought against everything she was observing. The officer in Stuttgart had been so certain. The photographs had looked real, the details had been specific. Why would an SS officer lie to 200 women about something so important? But if they were telling the truth about the showers, why were the Americans feeding them? Why treat them with even basic decency if they planned to kill them all anyway? It made no tactical sense. It made no economic sense. It only made sense if the Americans actually intended to follow the rules they claimed to believe in. And if that was true, if the Americans really were following the Geneva Convention, really were treating prisoners humanely, then what did that mean about everything else Margaret had been told? What did it mean about who the real barbarians were in this war? The question terrified her because she already suspected the answer. On April 18th, the engines changed pitch. The constant thrumming that had been the soundtrack to 12 days at sea shifted to a slower, deeper rhythm. They were arriving. Margaret woke to Eva, shaking her shoulder. "Come look. You have to see this." She climbed out of her bunk and pressed her face against the porthole, straining to see through the small circle of glass. Manhattan rose from morning mist like something from a dream or a hallucination. Buildings reached into the sky, 20 stories, 30 stories, 40 stories tall, higher than anything Margaret had ever seen or imagined possible. Glass windows caught the sunrise and threw it back in 1,000 different angles, making the whole city shimmer like it was coated in diamonds. No ruins, no bomb craters, no skeletal remains of burned buildings, no streets reduced to rubble, just city, whole and intact and thriving and alive. The harbor was full of ships, dozens of them, cargo ships being loaded and unloaded by massive cranes, warships at anchor, their grey hulls bristling with guns, civilian vessels moving between piers, everywhere activity, commerce, normal life continuing as if war was something happening on another planet instead of across an ocean. How Eva breathed beside her, her breath fogging the glass. "How can they have this while we have nothing?" "Because they're thieves," Frau Richter said from across the hold, her voice carrying that brittle certainty that Margaret was beginning to recognize as fear disguised as conviction. "They built their wealth on the backs of others, stole resources from around the world. Of course they have abundance. It's not theirs. They took it." But Margaret was thinking something different, something she didn't dare say out loud. Or because the war didn't touch them, because they're across an ocean, because their cities weren't bombed into rubble, because they didn't start this war, and so they didn't suffer the consequences of starting it. Because maybe, just maybe, the propaganda about American weakness and degeneracy was as false as everything else. They were taken off the ship into a large warehouse-style building at the port. Bright fluorescent lights made Margaret squint after 12 days of dim hold lighting. The floors were clean, actually clean, not just swept, but mopped and waxed until they shone. Everything was organized with an efficiency that felt almost mechanical. American nurses waited at examination stations, 3 of them women in crisp white uniforms with red crosses on their sleeves, their hair pinned back, their hands scrubbed clean. One of them gestured Margaret forward. "Name the nurse," asked in accented German. "Fischer. Margaret Fischer." The examination was thorough but professional. Eyes, throat, lungs. The nurse's hands were gentle but impersonal, touching only what was necessary, maintaining a clinical distance. She made notes on a clipboard. "You're malnourished, but not critically," the nurse said. "Height, weight, blood pressure, all acceptable for your condition. Any chronic health issues, I should note?" "No." "Next station for delousing powder and uniform assignment. Move along, please." The uniform was a clean grey dress with PW stenciled on the back in black paint. "Prisoner of war." The letters felt like brands, like marks of ownership burned into fabric instead of flesh. But the dress itself was clean, whole. No holes, no lice, no stains. It had been washed and pressed and folded carefully before being handed to her. Then came photographs, fingerprints, paperwork. So much paperwork. Americans seemed to document everything in triplicate. The officer at the processing desk, a captain in his 50s with reading glasses perched on his nose, filled out forms with methodical precision, filing them in folders, organizing everything with the care of a librarian cataloguing books. Name, rank, unit, date of capture. He asked the questions in a flat tone, writing down the answers without judgment or commentary. Just facts being recorded for files that would be stored somewhere and probably never looked at again. "It's so organized," Eva whispered as they moved through the stations. "Like we're packages being processed instead of people." "Maybe that's all we are to them," Margaret said. Just numbers on forms, problems to be solved with procedures and paperwork. The American officer at the final processing station looked up from his clipboard. Transport to Camp Livingston, Louisiana, departs 0600 tomorrow. You'll be assigned barracks and work details upon arrival. Any questions? Silence. What question could they ask that would get an honest answer? Where's Louisiana? Eva whispered after they'd been dismissed. Frau Richter's answer came loud enough for everyone to hear. Deep South, where they lynched Negroes for entertainment, strung them up from trees and took photographs like it was a celebration. That's where they're taking us. That should tell you everything you need to know about American civilization. Annie Vogel started crying quietly, tears running down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking. Margaret stood at a window in the processing facility, looking out at American workers moving through their day. Normal people, men in work clothes carrying lunch pails, women in dresses walking to office jobs, everyone talking, laughing, going about their lives like war was something happening far away to someone else, which it was. For them, war was newsreels and radio broadcasts and letters from sons and husbands overseas. For them, war was something you read about over breakfast, not something that destroyed your home and killed your neighbors and turned your city into a landscape of rubble and corpses. Margaret pressed her palm against the cold glass and wondered if she'd ever feel normal again. Wondered if normal even existed anymore, or if it was just another thing the war had destroyed. The train journey south took 3 days, and through the windows, America unfolded like a geography lesson that contradicted every assumption Margaret had brought with her across the Atlantic. Pennsylvania first. Factories running at full capacity, their smokestacks streaming grey plumes into April sky. Women in overalls heading to factory shifts, lunch pails swinging from their hands, talking and laughing like work was just work, not survival. No bomb damage anywhere. Every building intact, every street whole, traffic moving normally, streetcars running on schedule, the machinery of normal life functioning exactly as it was supposed to function. Then Ohio. Farmland stretching to the horizon in every direction, green even in early spring, the earth rich and dark where plows had turned it. Tractors moving across fields planting the crops that would feed America and half of Europe besides. Barns standing solid and square, painted red with white trim, looking like illustrations from children's books about farm life. Houses with porches and windows with glass and roofs that didn't leak. Everything whole, everything working, everything abundant. Indiana brought small towns with white churches at their centers, steeples reaching toward heaven like prayers made solid. Main streets with shops open for business. Children playing in yards, kicking balls, riding bicycles, doing all the things children do when they're not huddled in bomb shelters, waiting for the all-clear signal. American flags everywhere hanging from porches, flying from poles painted on signs, a constant reminder of whose country this was and what that country believed it stood for. Where are all the starving people? Eva asked, her face pressed against the window. Where's the crime, the degeneracy, the social collapse we were told was destroying America from within? This is a propaganda display, Frau Richter said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. They're showing us their best areas, hiding the rest. Every country has showcase regions they parade for foreigners. But this went on for 3 days. 3 days of abundance. 3 days of intact infrastructure and functioning society, and people who looked healthy and well-fed and like they'd never missed a meal in their lives. If this was a propaganda display, it was the most elaborate and thorough propaganda display ever constructed. Kentucky and Tennessee brought more of the same. More farmland, more small towns, more ordinary people living ordinary lives in a country that seemed completely untouched by the war that had destroyed half of Europe and large parts of Asia. Margaret watched it all through the window and felt something cracking inside her chest, some fundamental assumption about the world that was breaking under the weight of observable reality. Maybe it was all lies, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. What was Eva asked? Everything. Everything we were told about America. everything we were taught to believe. On April 22nd, the train pulled into Louisiana. The heat hit them first when the doors opened, humid and thick and oppressive, nothing like the climate in Germany. It was like stepping into a warm, wet blanket that wrapped around you and made breathing difficult. Pine trees grew everywhere, tall and straight and alien, their needles covering the ground in thick carpets of rust-colored brown. The camp sprawled across cleared land, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, wire fences marking boundaries, guard towers at the corners. But the guards in those towers looked relaxed, professional, but not aggressive men doing a job rather than men looking for excuses to inflict violence. The American flag snapped in the breeze at the camp's center, stars and stripes vivid against pale sky. As they marched through the gates, Margaret could see other prisoners. German men in a separate compound visible through the wire. Some of them waved, called out questions in German. "Where are you from? Did you see Hamburg? Is Berlin still standing? Do you have news about the Eastern Front?" The guards separated the groups firmly, but without violence, just professional boundary maintenance, keeping order without cruelty. Inside the administrative building, more paperwork, more processing, more documentation of every detail. Captain Robert Harrison reviewed their files with the same methodical precision Margaret had seen in New York. Late 30s, weathered face that suggested outdoor work, calm demeanor that suggested he'd done this many times before and knew exactly what he was doing. "Welcome to Camp Livingston," he said through a translator, a young Chinese-American corporal whose German was flawless. "You'll be assigned to barracks after medical clearance and delousing." That word, delousing. Margaret's stomach dropped like she'd stepped off a cliff. 2 years dissolved in an instant. Suddenly, she was back in that lecture hall in Stuttgart, 22 years old, watching photographs of shower rooms, listening to an SS officer describe with absolute certainty what happened to prisoners who were told they needed to be deloused. The specific details, the methodology, the casual efficiency of mass murder disguised as hygiene. Around her, she could feel the same realization spreading through the group like ice water. Bodies going rigid, breathing becoming shallow. The fear that had been lurking in the background for 12 days, suddenly front and center, undeniable, immediate. Sergeant Dorothy Matthews stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the wall. Name tag visible on her uniform. Mid-20s, competent, bearing professional posture. She spoke, and Margaret's world tilted slightly, because the German that came out of Matthews' mouth was fluent native speaker German, not the broken military phrases most American guards managed. "I'm Sergeant Matthews. I'll be your primary contact during processing and barracks assignment." She spoke with a slight Wisconsin accent. The vowels just slightly rounded in a way that marked her as someone who'd grown up in the upper Midwest. "Follow instructions. Cooperate with processing procedures and you'll be treated fairly according to Geneva Convention standards. We follow international law here." Frau Richter's eyes narrowed. Geneva Convention. As if they follow it. As if any of these rules mean anything to them. Matthews met her gaze directly. Voice firm but not aggressive. "We do. You'll see." Margaret noticed something. Matthews' German was too good for standard military training. This was family language, kitchen table German, bedtime story German. This woman had grown up speaking it probably to parents or grandparents who'd immigrated decades ago, which meant German heritage, German blood, as the propaganda would have said, maybe even relatives still in Germany. Why would someone with German ancestry volunteer to guard German prisoners? What did that say about her loyalties, her beliefs, her understanding of who the enemy was? The question would be answered 3 days later in a conversation that would make Margaret cry. But first, she had to survive the next 20 minutes. All new arrivals proceed to delousing and shower facilities, Matthews said. Her voice was calm, professional, like she was explaining a routine procedure that happened every day, which it probably did. The room went silent. Not the silence of people listening carefully. The silence of people who'd stopped breathing. Remove all clothing and place personal items in the bins provided. Matthews continued. You'll receive them back after the cleaning process. This is standard procedure for all incoming prisoners regardless of nationality or gender. Someone gasped. Margaret wasn't sure who. Maybe it was her. Showers, a voice whispered in German. They're taking us to the showers, delousing another voice corrected. That's what they always call it. That's what the officer in Stuttgart said. They always use the word delousing. That's how they make you go quietly. Annie Vogel backed against the wall, her whole body shaking, her face drained of colour. She looked like she might faint or vomit or both. Frau Richter stood, her voice loud enough to carry across the entire room. We know what happens in your showers. Matthew's expression shifted from professional calm to confusion. What? What are you talking about? Frau Richter's voice shook with rage and terror mixed together until you couldn't tell which was which. The gas chambers. The executions. We were told, we know exactly what you do in shower rooms. We know what delousing means. We're not stupid. We're not going to walk quietly into death. Matthew's face went through a rapid series of changes. Confusion, giving way to understanding, giving way to something that looked like horror. She turned to Corporal Wu, the translator, and said something in English, her voice tight with an emotion Margaret couldn't quite identify. Oh my God, Matthews said, still in English. They actually think we're going to gas them. Jesus Christ. They think the showers are execution chambers. The room erupted, women backing away from the door that led to the shower facilities. Annie Vogel sobbing openly, now saying over and over, I don't want to die like this, please, I don't want to die. Eva grabbed Margaret's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I'm scared, Eva said. God, I'm so scared. Frau Richter's voice rose above the chaos. We won't go quietly. We'll fight. You'll have to drag us. We have dignity, even if you don't. Margaret stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her mind racing through everything she knew, everything she'd been taught, everything she'd observed in the last 2 weeks. The officer in Stuttgart had been so certain. The photographs had been real. The details had been specific. Gas chambers disguised as showers. It was exactly what the Nazis themselves had done to Jews and political prisoners and anyone else deemed unworthy of life. Why wouldn't the Americans do the same? But also, the blankets on the ship, the real food, the medical care for Annie, the professional treatment, the careful documentation, the nurse's gentle hands during the examination, the absence of cruelty, even when cruelty would have been easy. Everything she'd observed suggested people following rules, not people preparing for mass murder. Which was true? The training or the evidence, the propaganda or her own eyes? Matthews took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm herself, trying to figure out how to handle a situation she clearly hadn't been prepared for. Listen to me, she said in German, her voice firm but patient. We are not going to hurt you. These are real showers, water and soap. That's all. Just water and soap. That's what you tell everyone before you seal the doors, Frau Richter shouted back. I'm going to show you, Matthews said. She walked toward the metal door that led to the shower facilities. Steam was still pouring out from the gap at the bottom, white and thick and ominous looking. She pushed the door open wider. Through the steam, visible in glimpses, when the white clouds shifted, were white tiled walls. Rows of shower heads mounted on those walls, benches along the sides, and women, American women. Female soldiers in various states of undress, washing themselves under streams of water that were very obviously water and not gas. One of them looked up startled and grabbed a towel to cover herself. Sarge. What the hell? We got an audience now. Sorry, Jenkins, Matthews said, proving a point. She turned back to the German women pressed against the opposite wall. This is where we all shower. American soldiers, German prisoners, everyone. It's a shower. That's it. That's all it is. She pointed at the shower heads. Water comes out of those. Hot water. You wash your body and your hair. You get clean. Then you get dressed in clean clothes and go to your assigned barracks. There's no gas, no executions, no tricks. Just basic hygiene that's required before you can enter the general camp population. Nobody moved. Fear was too deep. The training had been too thorough. The officer in Stuttgart had been too certain. You didn't just erase that kind of conditioning with a simple demonstration. Matthews made a decision. I'll prove it. She walked into the shower room, fully clothed, boots and uniform and everything. The American soldiers who were actually showering stared at her like she'd lost her mind. She walked right up to one of the shower heads, reached up and turned the knob. Water burst from the shower head. Clear water, steaming hot, hitting Matthew's hand and splashing across her face and soaking into her uniform. She held her hand under the stream for several seconds, then cupped her palms and splashed water onto her face, letting it run down her neck and soak into her collar. She turned back toward the doorway, dripping wet, her uniform darkening with water stains. Sea water. That's all it is. Just water. She stood there for a moment, letting them look at her, letting the evidence sink in. Then she spoke again, and her voice had changed, become softer, less professional, more human. I understand you've been told lies about us, about America, about what we do to prisoners. But you're going to learn that most of what you were told was propaganda, designed to make you fight to the death instead of surrendering, designed to make you prefer dying to giving up. She gestured around the room at the shower facilities, at the American soldiers who were now watching this whole scene with confused expressions. We don't gas prisoners. We don't torture women. We follow the Geneva Convention. We follow international law. We follow the rules of war even when our enemies don't. Because that's what separates us from the people we're fighting. That's what makes us different. She paused. Let that sink in. Now you need to be cleaned and deloused before you can enter the general camp population. This is for your health and for everyone else's health. Lice carry disease. We can't have an outbreak. So this is going to happen one way or another. Her voice became firmer. You can walk in voluntarily and do this the easy way. Or we can have guards physically assist you and do this the hard way. Your choice. But either way, you're getting clean before you go to barracks. Silence. Nobody moved. Fear had paralyzed them all. Frau Richter's voice came out broken, cracked, all the certainty drained away, leaving only terror. This is the trick. The elaborate trick before the killing. Make us think we're safe, then seal the doors. Eva was crying, quiet tears running down her face. Annie Vogel had collapsed onto the floor, hyperventilating, making small wounded animal sounds. And Margaret Fisher stood in the center of the room, feeling the weight of every eye on her, even though nobody was actually looking at her directly, feeling the moment crystallize around a choice she hadn't asked to make, but couldn't avoid making. In 5 seconds she would say something, and whatever she said would ripple through the rest of her life, through the lives of every woman in this room, through history itself in ways she couldn't possibly predict. Because sometimes courage isn't knowing you'll survive. Sometimes courage is walking forward when you believe you won't. Margaret took a breath. I'll go first, she said. Every head turned toward her. The room, already silent somehow, became even more silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. What? Eva gasped. Maggie, no, don't. Someone has to, Margaret said. Her voice was steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to sound, with her heart trying to break through her ribs and her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She looked at the women around her, at Eva, with tears on her face, at Annie collapsed on the floor, at Frau Richter standing rigid with terror disguised as defiance. "If they're going to kill us," Margaret said quietly, "waiting won't change anything. And if they're telling the truth—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The implication hung in the air between them. If the Americans were telling the truth, if the showers really were just showers, then everything they'd been taught was a lie. Everything they'd believed about the enemy was propaganda. Everything they'd fought for was based on deception. "Margaret, don't be a fool," Frau Richter said, but her voice had no force behind it. Margaret didn't answer, just started walking toward the door, toward the steam, toward the unknown. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. Her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her legs felt like water, like they might give out with every step. Her hands were shaking. She remembered the officer in Stuttgart, his absolute certainty, the photographs, the specific details about how the gas came through the shower heads and how long it took to die, and how the bodies were disposed of afterward. But she also remembered Matthews standing under the water, Matthews who was still alive, Matthews whose uniform was still wet. So either this was the most elaborate deception ever constructed, or they'd been lied to. Either she was about to die, or she was about to learn the truth. Margaret reached the doorway, crossed the threshold, stepped into the steam, into the white-tiled room that smelled like soap and disinfectant, into a moment that would define the rest of her life. Behind her, she heard footsteps, Eva following. Then more footsteps. Annie helped to her feet by other women. Then more and more, until the sound of footsteps on tile became a rhythm, became movement, became 38 women walking into their fear to find out what waited on the other side. Inside the shower room, white tiles stretched in all directions, clean and clinical and terrifying. The air was thick with steam and the smell of soap, industrial disinfectant, clean smells that somehow made Margaret's terror worse because they were so ordinary, so normal, so completely unlike what she'd expected. Matthew stood near the entrance, watching but not threatening. "Remove your uniform," she said through the translator. "Place it in the bin. You'll get clean clothes after." Margaret's hands trembled as she unbuttoned her prison dress. This was it. This was the moment. This was where the deception would be revealed, where the doors would seal, where the gas would come. She removed the dress, stood in her threadbare undergarments that had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly transparent, felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with nakedness and everything to do with vulnerability, with being completely at the mercy of people she'd been taught to fear. Matthews handed her a small towel. Everything she said, her voice not unkind. "Complete delousing means complete cleaning." Margaret removed everything, wrapped the towel around herself. Behind her she heard other women entering, Eva's footsteps, Annie's quiet sobbing, more women following her lead, following her into what might be death following, because someone had to go first, and she'd volunteered. "Shower heads are on the wall," Matthews said, gesturing. "Turn the knob left for hot water, right for cold. Soap in the dispensers. Shampoo, too. Take your time. Get clean." A pause. "And breathe. It's just water." Margaret walked to the nearest shower head. Her legs felt like they might give out with every step. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt, actually hurt like something breaking inside her chest. She reached up, hand shaking, fingers barely able to grip the metal knob. This was the moment. Either water would come out or gas. Either she'd been lied to her entire adult life, or she was about to die. Either everything she believed was false, or this was the most elaborate deception ever constructed. She turned the knob. Water burst from the shower head. Hot water, almost scalding. Hitting her hand, her arms splashing across her face, soaking into the towel wrapped around her body. Real water. Not gas, not poison, not death. Just water. Margaret stood frozen as the water poured over her, and something inside her chest broke open like a dam giving way. She hadn't had a hot shower in 2 years. 2 years of cold water sponge baths in bombed-out buildings, washing in bathroom sinks when there was running water at all, going days without being able to wash because there was no water, or no privacy, or no safety. 2 years of lice she couldn't get rid of no matter how hard she tried, of dirt ground so deep into her skin it became part of her, of never feeling clean, of living like an animal in the ruins of a dying nation. And now this. Hot water, soap, steam, heat soaking into her skin. The simple, profound luxury of being able to wash her body and hair with actual soap and actual hot water. She reached for the soap dispenser with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, lathered her hair, felt the hot water rinse away 2 years of grime and fear and exhaustion and despair. And she started to cry, not quiet tears, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere in her chest, where she'd been holding everything since the bombs started falling, since her city was destroyed, since Germany collapsed around her, and she had to keep working, keep functioning, keep pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine and hadn't been fine for years. Around her, other women were entering the shower room, standing under other shower heads, turning knobs with trembling hands, discovering the same truth Margaret had discovered. "It's real," Eva kept saying from somewhere nearby, her voice breaking. "It's real water. It's real. Oh God, it's real." Annie Vogel was washing her face over and over like she couldn't believe the water kept coming, kept being just water. Other women stood frozen under the streams, tears mixing with shower water, the sound of crying mixing with the sound of running water until you couldn't tell which was which. The American soldiers who'd been showering when this started had quietly left, giving them privacy. Only Matthews remained near the door standing guard, but not watching, giving them space to process what they were learning. Margaret slid down the tile wall until she was sitting on the floor, hot water pouring over her, steam rising around her like fog. Eva sat down beside her, also crying, also unable to stand under the weight of what this meant. "They lied to us," Eva said, barely audible over the water. "About everything." Yes, people died believing the lies. Germans who could have surrendered, Americans we killed. All of it for lies. Yes. Margaret wrapped her arms around her knees and let the water run over her and grieved, not just for the war, not just for Germany, but for the years she'd lost believing propaganda, for the trust that could never be rebuilt, for the innocence that had been stolen by people who'd looked her in the eye and told her elaborate specific lies about shower gas chambers. If they'd lied about this, what else had been lies? The propaganda about American brutality, the claims about democracy's weakness, the entire justification for the war. Matthews called out, her voice echoing off tile. Time to finish up, clean clothes waiting in the next room. Margaret turned off the water, wrapped herself in a clean towel. Her skin felt raw, exposed, but clean. For the first time in 2 years, actually clean. In the dressing room they were given clean prison uniforms, grey dresses, clean underwear, socks without holes, everything fresh and whole and intact. Eva appeared beside her, also dressed, looking shell-shocked. "They didn't kill us," Eva said, her voice hollow. "No, they gave us hot water and soap." "Yes." Eva's face crumpled. "Everything we were told was a lie." Margaret had no answer, only the feeling of clean skin against clean fabric, and the terrible understanding that nothing would ever be the same, that she could never go back to the person she'd been an hour ago, the person who'd believed what she was told, who'd trusted authority, who'd thought she knew how the world worked. That night in the barracks, 38 women lay in their bunks in darkness, unable to sleep, processing what had happened. Margaret stared at the ceiling, feeling the clean sheets against her clean skin, and understood that the shower hadn't just washed away dirt. It had washed away certainty. And what remained was more terrifying than anything she'd been taught to fear. Because if everything she'd believed was false, what could she believe in now?